Good morning, everybody. I'm Elisa Massimino, President and CEO of Human Rights First. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much to Admiral for this incredible venue. We love this place, and we're definitely coming back. I encourage all of you on the way out during the reception to take a look at the exhibits. They're amazing. We're here today because 2 weeks ago, the President gave a major speech on counterterrorism that addressed a panoply of issues from Guantanamo to targeted killing to whether wartime authorities will continue to be necessary for the evolving threats posed by international terrorism. It was, in my view, one of the most important speeches on national security since 9/11, and it set out an interesting and ambitious agenda for moving our nation past a decade of war towards a post-war counterterrorism strategy that is not defined by drones or Guantanamo or, more generally, the projection of American military force abroad. The speech, however, left a lot of open questions about how precisely the administration is going to follow through on the President's vision and whether Congress is going to be willing to engage on that constructively or obstructionist, as we've seen sometimes in the past. Key among those open questions is what the administration and Congress are prepared to do to move the ball forward on Guantanamo. The President pledged to go back at it, as he said, to close Guantanamo and to use his executive authority to the maximum extent to transfer some detainees. But most people believe, rightly I think, that Congress also has to play a role if Guantanamo is going to be closed. And then there's the question of targeted killing, most commonly captured in the public's imagination by the drone campaign. The President spoke of the need for more oversight and transparency about targeted killings, but the American people still don't have a very clear picture of the standards and the procedures governing drone strikes and the oversight mechanisms that help ensure that the program is lawful and effective. The President acknowledged past mistakes in the post-9/11 period, chief among them being the decision to torture detainees in our custody. But he did not, during the speech, address the need to have a complete factual record of those mistakes, even as his administration reviews the Senate Select Intelligence Committee's 6,000-plus page multi-year study on the post-9/11 CIA so-called enhanced interrogation program, the torture program. Finally, the President spoke about the need to bring an end to the armed conflict against al-Qaeda and related groups and to avoid the trap of perpetual war. He called for refining and ultimately repealing the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which you'll hear referred to as the AUMF, the foundational law that was passed in the wake of 9/11, which undergirds many of the wartime counterterrorism military operations that we're going to talk about today. What then does a post-war counterterrorism strategy look like? That's what we're going to talk about here today. This week, Human Rights First has brought to Washington a group of 20 distinguished retired military leaders, two of whom you'll hear from this morning. Many others are in the audience today. This is a group that Human Rights First has been privileged to work with for more than a decade on issues that relate to human rights, counterterrorism, the rule of law, and American ideals. They're here in town this week for meetings with members of the administration. We were at the White House yesterday, senior officials on the Hill, members of Congress, to talk about and to urge swift action to deliver on the vision set out in the President's speech. So, to discuss these issues, we're very pleased to have two of these distinguished military leaders with us this morning. But first, I want to introduce another distinguished member of our panel, the moderator, Steve Clemons, who many of you, I'm sure, know. Steve is a good friend of Human Rights First. He's the founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, which aims to promote a new American internationalism that combines a tough-minded realism about our nation's interests in the world and a pragmatic idealism about the kind of world order that is best suited to America's democratic way of life. We love that mission, and we love Steve, and we're very, very pleased that he's agreed to join us here to help moderate this discussion. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Elisa's going to join our panel. I want to commend Human Rights First and Elisa for sponsoring in Washington just so many great forums that don't follow the predictable curve of many of such forums and basically reach into new audiences. And I think that the generals and admirals you brought together, two of whom distinguished examples we have here today, have really helped move the conversation forward on vital national issues. To my left, I have a good friend, Major General Paul Eaton. General Eaton was recently retired from the United States Army after more than 33 years of service. His assignments include infantry command from the company to brigade levels, command of the infantry center at Fort Benning, and chief of infantry. His most recent operational assignment was commanding general of the command charged with reestablishing Iraqi security forces from 2003 to 2004, where he built the command and established the structure and infrastructure of the Iraqi armed forces. Other operational assignments include Somalia, Bosnia, Albania. He was the Deputy Commanding General for Transformation and Striker Unit Development, and is an assistant professor and head of the French department at West Point. At one point, he was a 1972 graduate from West Point. But he is also someone that, at the New America Foundation and many of my other hats, I've enjoyed working with General Eaton. Rear Admiral John Hutson, between the two of these guys, there are 60 years of military service. Served in the United States Navy from 1973 to 2000. He was the Navy's Judge Advocate General from 1997 to 2000. He's now Dean Emeritus of the University of New Hampshire School of Law in Concord, and he also joined Human Rights First Board of Directors in 2005. So it's great to have all of you here.
Thank you,
I guess I would first ask, we're going to talk about the President's remarks and thinking, and I'm still in my own mind kicking around what this important speech meant and what is real and not real. Because, and I guess part of me when I heard it was very moved that this is the first time I've heard a President of the United States essentially try to forfeit powers or try to invite the judiciary and the legislative branches into the kind of key questions. I asked John Podesta the day after Barack Obama was elected in 2008 how many executive powers he thought an Obama administration would give back that the previous administrations may have taken. And John Podesta said, probably none. And I am interested in whether or not you believe that you believe in this Magna Carta moment, if you will, of Barack Obama, or do you still worry that the way in which he has begun to unfold this question of reducing, to a certain degree, presidential authority is something that could easily slip back into old patterns? Let me start with the Admiral.
I think both. I want to believe, and I think I do believe that he's absolutely sincere in his desire to do that. But on the second day of his administration, we literally stood behind him while he was signing executive orders closing Guantanamo and ending the torture campaign. And that hasn't all come to pass. So that it will take more than wonderful soaring rhetoric. It's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's going to take some courage, both by the president and by people that are working for him, and significantly by people on the Hill who don't always agree with him. But if they have the moral courage to do the kinds of things that need to be done, I think that will happen. And we, there's going to be another president, and there's going to be a president after that, and a president after that, and we need to have the long view on this, I think.
General Eaton?
I saw that speech as pretty much an attempt to reverse a trend that's been going on for decades, and an accelerating trend since 9/11, and a concentration of powers within the executive branch that is not, in my eyes, consistent with the U.S. Constitution. So it's an indicator that he's willing to reverse this trend and to bring Congress back online, to hold Congress accountable for the use of military force, and to engage Congress to do several of the components of that speech. So my interpretation, he was, as the Commander-in-Chief, he gave his guidance on that speech. On 23 May, he issued commander's guidance. And what we have to have right now at the operational level, we have to have operators implement the components that he put out in that speech.
Elisa, do you find yourself more skeptical or more of a believer in the president after those remarks?
Well, I guess I was never I was never a believer that everything was going to change when Barack Obama took office, because it is kind of an occupational hazard for any president that you want to preserve maximum flexibility to deal with all the challenges that you have. And so, to me, the most important thing here is not the question of whether the president is going to unilaterally disarm himself of some powers and get back to kind of regular constitutional order, but it's really the link that he made between that and the state of war. In our democracy, it's normal. Now, the Supreme Court has said it's not a blank check. A state of war is not a blank check for the executive branch. But it is true that in wartime, the executive has more flexibility, greater powers. And what I heard the president saying, really, the real pivot in that speech was to an exit strategy for this war, which is a different kind of war and needs a different kind of exit strategy than we have had in prior conflicts. And that, by its nature and under our democracy, means a return to regular order in terms of the balance of powers in our government. So, and I think that's a very, very good thing and a welcome thing, and I agree with Admiral Hutson and General Eaton that it was a good speech, but it needs now operationalization.
Did you find it odd that when the president began to intimate that the authorization for use of military force that had authorized previous deployments was going to expire, that they were going to basically punctuate the end of that at some point in the not-too-distant future, and you had members of Congress basically protesting that and wanting to maintain essentially a blank check and an open authorization, fairly indefinitely? Did that surprise you that Congress essentially want to continue to abdicate those authorities?
No. Yeah. I mean, I think that, whenever anyone in the executive branch says we really want to engage Congress, they obviously need to be careful what they wish for. But I think the president's right to want to engage Congress on this, and I certainly wasn't surprised that he wants to point the way towards an end to the powers that he was given under the authorization for the use of military force. I mean, he, in the speech, very clearly laid out that the conflict that was launched with that in response to the attacks and under that authorization is nearly won. We have other threats, but as he said, not every threat generates a war. And that's the new part that now he pointed the way, as General Eaton said, to a post-war counterterrorism strategy. Not that there aren't threats, but that that not every threat requires the strategy of war.
We're in this sort of funny situation where the president, and I'll overstate it to make the point maybe, but the president's saying, I don't want all this authority, and Congress is shoving it on him, saying, no, you got it, pal, take it and run. I made the point with the White House staff when we spoke yesterday that college freshmen now have lived under the AUMF since they were 6 years old, generally. So that's what they believe, and that's the normal state of affairs. People of our age recognize that it's not, but for younger people, that's the normal state of affairs. And Plato said that only the dead have seen their last war, and so there will be other struggles. There are going to be other kinds of fights, and we have to conduct this one in such a way that we can effectively prosecute the next one, whatever that may be. And I think we need to end this, at least in terms of the AUMF, or dramatically limit the AUMF.
Any president has to essentially wrestle with contending priorities and basically look at what you're going to trade off to achieve whatever big goal they had. And, you know, when I listen to him on Guantanamo, I'm reminded of Greg Craig, and Greg, who I admit is a good friend of mine, worked very hard to basically lay down the track for how Guantanamo might be shut down. Now, essentially 4 years after that, we're back at that same, on that same task. And it seems to me that the first time around, while the President, Eric Holder, and others talked a lot about wanting to shut Guantanamo, they weren't willing to trade, you know, politically to achieve that end, and they ended up reducing it. What do any of you believe that shutting Guantanamo has risen in the roster of priorities, that they're willing to trade political capital to really achieve it this time? Or is this just more posturing for progressives and the left and make Elisa Massimino happy, but really fundamentally not delivering? Yeah, I do too. But there's a credibility question, because they did have a person who was essentially solely devoted to closing, and Rahm Emanuel essentially said that's really not what we're going to trade for at this point. That's not going to be our defining step forward.
But he raised it again. You know,
Yeah.
the president raised it again, and I think that if he weren't dedicated to doing it, now we'll see if he does, if he'll take the operational action that's necessary in order to actually do it. If he weren't dedicated to doing it, if he said, well, this isn't worth it, I got too many other fights to fight, I don't want to use the political capital, I don't think he would have raised it, the idea again. He'd have let it go.
General?
It's consistent with the rest of the speech that if we're going to back away from perpetual war, the Guantanamo issue is the poster child for where we've been for the last 13 years, 12 years. And I was traveling up in British Columbia, and outside a movie theater was Gulag Americana, and a picture of Guantanamo prisoners, and there was a documentary about it. Guantanamo informed the Abu Ghraib fiasco, and we've got General Taguba in the audience right now, who is the general officer charged with investigating what happened at Abu Ghraib. So this Guantanamo thing is has a greater life than itself, and it is a projection of a number of unfortunate decisions. And the fact that the president brought it up again is heartening, and we'll see if he puts the operational touch to actually execute the closure.
But as I recall, one of the reasons it didn't proceed forward is that the Congress would not authorize or appropriate monies for the prisons that were there. So there are ways in which Congress has to be involved and supportive of the decision, and if not, they can simply not authorize the funds to move forward. Am I incorrect in that, Elisa?
Well, you know, partially correct, but in fact, I think that, you know, part of the problem was with this sense of not wanting to spend political capital while they were in the middle of the fight about health care and all of that,
Right.
I think was a miscalculation. Now, you know, partly you can forgive the administration that because, you know, they were fresh off of a campaign in which both major candidates were vying for who was going to close Guantanamo fastest. And so they might have been lulled into the belief that we had, you know, consensus around this, and therefore underestimated the degree to which they'd have to push hard and, you know, use the bully pulpit and convince the American people that this was a smart thing to do for our national security. So they got off to a rocky start that way, and then pulled back, I think, prematurely when there was concern about bringing people to trial in the United States, the 9/11 conspirators, after that was announced. And so because they didn't plow forward through that, it left a vacuum that Congress then stepped in. And yes, absolutely, they made it more difficult. But I think what I heard in the president's speech was a recognition that he has not done as much as he can within his power. It's more limited than it was, but there's still some running room there to create momentum to close it down. And I heard a commitment to do that, to lift the moratorium that was self-imposed, not by Congress, on transfers to Yemen, and figure out a way to manage those risks, to use the waiver authorities that they have or negotiate some better ones with Congress, to launch these review boards that are a year late that they promised to do for the people that they had deemed too dangerous to release, to make sure that they're evaluating that, to press forward on all those fronts to try to create some momentum. So I think that it's not just political posturing. I hope it's not, but it certainly, to me, sounds like a commitment to at least run as far as they can work with Congress to see if they can go beyond that. Recognize that at the end there may be some really tough cases that we don't know yet what the strategy will be to solve those, but with the confidence that once we get to that point, we'll have a better sense of the problem that we're dealing with.
Let me talk to all of you for a moment about drones, because this was another interesting aspect of the president's speech, that essentially Barack Obama, Tom Donilon, John Brennan, Dennis McDonough have been meeting for years every morning and reviewing kill lists and using a military capacity, which I think is a fairly low bar capacity technologically. And there are probably some in the room who know much more about this than I do. But I recently interviewed the founder of Google Maps, a guy named Mike Jones, who's now at Google, and I just said, how hard is it just to use the stuff you've got in there essentially as a spatial directive, and then come up with some sort of less sophisticated version of a drone and arm it in some way? Are we facing an era where you're going to have a lot of drone proliferation, everyone will have it? But on this broad issue of kill lists, where are you guys, with the generals and admirals on your list on the question of drones? Would you have supported killing Alaki? It's my job.
I know.
Judge advocate.
I am personally, I'm strongly ambivalent about it. I think that there are positive aspects. It's another weapon in the arsenal, and that the United States, in fighting these future wars, has to be able to use all the weapons in the arsenal that are legitimate. I was going to say problem, or the threat. What we need to recognize is that we are potentially in the process of creating international law on the use of these things, and it can come back
because of the precedent of the
because of the we've started it, it's there, and we need to put some parameters around it, because it can come back and bite us in the ass if it doesn't, because it's not that complicated from what I understand. Other countries can do it, and so that we need to be able to say in the future, these are the rules by which you can use drones, and if we fail in that now, we could find ourselves swimming upstream in the future. So I'm worried about that part of it.
Paul, are you an advocate of drones?
My colleague's use of the word ambivalence is I view it from a cost benefit. The commanders in counterinsurgency environments ask the question, did I create more insurgents today than I took off the street? And the real issue with extrajudicial killings, and the drone is the instrument by which we are able to do that. And it reminds me of the posters in the Midwest in the 1800s, wanted, dead or alive. And a drone, of course, will give you dead with the person that you're going after, because, in the president's words, if he could have captured, he would, and that was not an option with al-Awlaki, and we killed him. We, the United States of America, killed him. And so we go back to, is the drone work in Yemen, in North Africa, in Pakistan, creating more of a problem from a foreign policy, national security perspective for the United States, or is it not? And is taking out the terrorist with a drone strike on an individual basis, is that actually making us safer when you consider what it might create as far as antipathy to the United States?
Elisa, is there a bit of hypocrisy that we have to accept, essentially? Because as I think about the president giving this speech and what got him to that speech, essentially was the reality that al-Qaeda has been decimated. Al-Qaeda has been decimated largely by drone strikes. So you have this uncomfortable reality that drones got you to the point of achieving what might be called a military success, or at least a breathing room, so that you could actually get back to something that was more consistent with the human rights standards of the United States. So do you have to live with both to actually get on a better track, Elisa?
I don't think so. You know, I think that one of the reasons this speech was so important was that, you know, instead of dealing with these issues in isolation, Guantanamo, drones, you know, the president put this in the context of the conflict that we launched after 9/11 is winding down. And if you're in an armed conflict, again, just to get to the drone question, I mean, it's sort of like asking, are you in favor of, you know, any other weapon delivery system? You know, it really depends, unless you're a defense contractor, I suppose. You know, the deployment of that, it really depends on the scope of the armed conflict. If you're using a weapon to eliminate an enemy who's targetable under the law of armed conflict, drones can be a very good thing, right? Targeted killing is better than indiscriminate killing, which is a war crime. You know, it enables you to be more targeted. So, you know, in the absolute sense, that's certainly fine. But what the president did in his speech is put all this into the context of the scope and duration of the armed conflict. And because that's winding down, we need to have a more constrained use of lethal force. So I think that's really important. And, you know, he didn't talk about it in the speech, but what Admiral Hutson said is absolutely true. You know, the number of countries that already have this technology is way more than most people think. I was at a meeting at RAND that had a lot of the drone industry folks there. And in preparation, I got online and looked to see, I wonder if they have a trade association, the drone people. And sure enough, they do. They meet in September in Moscow, in October in Beijing. And this technology is everywhere, and we are setting the rules of the road, if not law, by what we do. And so, you know, that's an added and quite urgent reason why we need to be clear about and more transparent, which the president keeps committing to, and that's good. Transparency doesn't equal legality, but it'll help the American people and the rest of the world understand that we're using this as a weapon in a lawful way, and that's surely very important.
I'd like to open the conversation in a few minutes to our audience as well, but before doing so, I guess I find myself disagreeing a little bit with Admiral Hutson's characterization about what constitutes the creation of law. The practice of drones isn't necessarily law, but it really raises an interesting question, because as you look back at some of the things we've done, I interviewed Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland, on Monday, and asked him if he felt in this time of introspection in the United States about some of the decisions made about detention facilities, secret prisons, the rendition policy of combat detainees. Was there any circumspection about Poland's role as a site of some of these secret prisons? And he refused to acknowledge that there were secret prisons, and he said WikiLeaks pointed to the fact that there might be some secret prisons, but certainly if we were to be asked in that situation again, we wouldn't find ourselves cooperating. And so it raises this interesting question about the gray rules of war. So from Guantanamo, where essentially you were able to fundamentally evade a kind of system of law in the U.S. and then have different applicable standards. We had rendition policy that, if you get into that story, and Karen Greenberg's stuff on torture and whatnot. The question is whether you can put the genie back in the bottle. Is that now all out, and has that so fundamentally tainted our ability? What would be necessary as the next step after President Obama's speech to actually get a Geneva-like process again, where you come back and negotiate with global stakeholders what the rules of new war ought to be? Because I think, I have a friend here, Ray McGovern and others, who sort of think the old rules are just fine, but I guess I don't agree with that, because I don't believe that anyone is practicing by those old rules. So the question is, do we need an era of new negotiations, new stakeholders, and what's that look like?
I have advocated, like to my wife and my golden retriever, that we, the United States, ought to be considering sort of reopening the Geneva Conventions. That the Geneva Conventions talk about soldiers, and they talk about spies, and they talk about saboteurs, and they talk about doctors, and they talk about civilians, but they don't talk about terrorists. and that the new face of war likely is going to be terrorism for the foreseeable future, at least for the United States. And I think that the lack of, we tried to get too cute. And we dealt with terrorists like they were soldiers, sometimes with military commissions that General Hemingway's familiar with, but that they were civilians and criminals sort of at other times. And I think that somehow we need to be able to address that, whether it's in the context of the Geneva Conventions or not. Now, to your other point, I think that you were right. I was being too glib and cryptic. That our use of drones doesn't change the rules with regard to discrimination and proportionality and those kinds of hard bedrock law of war kinds of things. But like torture, the fact that we're waterboarding people doesn't suddenly make waterboarding okay. But it enables other countries to say, you did it too, and so we're going to do it to you, to your guys, to your CIA guys, and to other people that we've captured. Can you unring that bell? Walk the cat back? Maybe, but and this can get us into the Sissy report. You've got to be able to admit that you did it and that you were wrong about it. And if you can't admit that you did it, or you can't admit that you were wrong about it, you're never going to be able to expiate those events.
General Eaton?
We were having a meeting up in Human Rights First offices, and on the wall is a Dwight Eisenhower quote that whatever America hopes to bring to pass in the world must first come to pass in the heart of America. And we have some conditions, and we have a personality in our president right now, and I go back to 2008 when candidate Obama was having a big problem with the Reverend Wright issue, and he absolutely confronted the issue of race in America. And I was out of the country. I didn't get it live, but I was in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese were talking about it. And this I've got a big problem, and I'm going to confront it straight on. And I think that was kind of the quality of the speech that we heard on the 23rd of May. So he's got a big problem. I think that was a start. And again, as we've said, how he implements, how he operationalizes this thing is going to be the test.
Elisa?
Yeah, another thing we have up on the wall at our office back at Human Rights First is our tagline, which is American Ideals, Universal Values. And it's a reminder to us every day when we walk in that what this country does matters way more than what any other country in the world does, especially on human rights issues, because the United States was such a leader in helping to create the global system of universal rights, human rights norms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so what Admiral Hutson referenced, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, that's why it's so critical for the United States to and the American people to understand what happened during that period. This is a 6,000-page report. What Senator Feinstein said is the most significant oversight report that the Senate has ever done. But none of you can read it unless you're a staffer on the Intelligence Committee. I can't read it because it's still classified. And one of the things that we've all been asking for is that the administration get out of the way at least, if not endorse and work with the committee to get that report declassified and released. We know from our work on these issues in a lot of other countries, the United States, we always think that we're unique, and in so many good ways we are, but lots of countries have dealt with the threat of domestic terrorism or foreign terrorism, have stumbled off that cliff into the abyss as we did, and have had to deal with that and look themselves in the mirror. Sometimes it takes decades, But if you don't do it, it always festers, and it will undermine the ability of our country to lead globally on human rights and other issues, our integrity, what we stand for. So we need to get that report out, and that's one of the things that the group of generals and admirals have been asking for in these meetings this week.
Understanding that certain names are going to have to be redacted and methods and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of you there. I think just from my own perspective, one of the really interesting things about this speech, and I have talked to several cabinet officials since that speech who are close to the president, and what's not out there, I don't know if it's been reported in the press, the president himself spent a great deal of time with various journalists that they brought in, and he met with these journalists one-on-one. You haven't really seen that level of presidential deployment an issue. But you have this sense that Obama, the man, has been wanting to do this for a while. Obama, the presidential administration, is having a hard time managing itself and managing itself out of this business. It's why I continue to be pretty much a skeptic of the ability to move forward, because I think it's very hard for Obama, the man, to rein back the various bureaucracies and decisions and institutions. We all want to see an individual control the system there, but he seems to be struggling with this. I think if he were sitting in the panel today and we were grilling him on this, I think he would be lamenting to some degree how the operation works. But let me open up the floor to you. And since I mentioned you and I didn't take your name in vain, I'll start with Ray McGovern.
I'm Ray McGovern from Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Thanks.
And we're going to have a question.
Okay. The question is this. Am I not hearing a lingering, perhaps unconscious deference being given to the Commander-in-Chief here? You guys are retired now. When are we going to stop praising the President in the subjunctive mood?
Just for the record, I didn't praise.
Yeah, all right. You know? I mean, even his lofty rhetoric has prevarication in it. We don't say lies in this country. He prefers capture to killing. Give me a break. He prefers to release the people in Guantanamo, but Congress won't let him. As you know, and I'm astounded that it has not come up today, 68 people in Guantanamo could be released this afternoon if the President had any moral courage. So my question to you is this. Would you stand behind the President today? Do you expect you would stand behind the President next year at this time? Please answer the question.
Thank you. Admiral?
Sure. I'd stand behind virtually any president. I guess I can think of a few in history that I might stand off to the side with. But I'm retired from the military, but I'm still an American, and he's still the president. And I still wish him well and will do anything within my meager power to enable him to achieve the goals.
This does get at a deeper question is, are we so hopeful about the speech that we're letting the President off too much? I mean, the President has really expanded many of the practices. Let me just, take a shorthand. Many of the human rights first concerns about the Bush administration, Bush-Cheney administration, have been expanded and deepened under President Obama. Are we letting the President off too lightly? Paul?
To answer your question, sir, yes, I would stand behind him. I, on 1 July 1968, took the oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Not to support the President, but to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So, would I stand behind him? Yes, he is the most powerful leader on the planet, and he is in a position to do great right by the United States and by the rest of the world. So I would give I am still in a position to criticize and to challenge and to coach and counsel if asked, but I trust this man's instincts, and I think that he will exercise his power appropriately in this term.
Yes, right here in the white shirt, gentleman. Yes.
Hi, my name is Philip Gallegos. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland, College Park, studying public policy, and I'm an intern with the National Academy of Public Administration. And my question for the panel is specifically about the drone program. I think the general consensus, many, if not most of us, would agree that the targeted killing of Anwar al-Awlaki several years ago was a pivotal moment in the history of the drone program. And my question for you, for the panel going forward, is should the United States differentiate between foreign nationals and American citizens waging war against America abroad? If the answer to that question is yes, how do we establish a framework for establishing transparency and oversight for the targeted killing of American citizens abroad, if that's the case?
Great question. Elisa?
Sure. I welcome the experts here to weigh in on this question. But again, I go back to, I often think that in this country we have a debate about the wrong aspect of the issue, and so we have focused so much on the nationality of targets in the drone program when really, I think it's fairly well established in the laws of war. If a fellow citizen takes up arms against our country and they're a combatant in a war, they're like any other combatant on the other side, and they can be killed if they're in, that other conditions are satisfied. So, yes, this is a different kind of war, but it's not that different in terms of the principles about being able to target your enemy. The question the real question, I think, is about the scope of that and what constitutes an enemy in a conflict like the one that we're engaged in now. And those are the questions that really will put somebody in or out. And it sounds like from all the, reading the tea leaves of various speeches, we don't have enough of the documents themselves, which we should have as Americans. We should be able to read those, the legal underpinnings of this program. But from reading the tea leaves, it sounds like there's a lot of debate and discussion internally about who falls in and who doesn't. That goes all the way up to the Oval Office to make these decisions and all that, that's unusual, I would say. I don't know, you can weigh in on how it works in other wars. But I think often we're missing kind of the real question. And so I think we need to have greater transparency about who the administration thinks we're at war with. For example, at this hearing a week or so ago in the Senate Armed Services Committee about the authorization for the use of military force, senators were asking the administration witness, essentially, who are we at war with? Is there a list? Who? And they didn't answer. They said they'll give them a list. They could go back to the office and get it. But
Which they don't have yet.
They don't have yet. We talked to senators yesterday in senators' offices, and they said they don't have it. So, if you can't answer that question, then you have kind of a problem about explaining to Americans and the rest of the world about whether what we're doing is inside the bounds of the laws of war, of the Geneva Conventions, which I want to say I have great trepidation about what Admiral Hutson has suggested about opening these back up. I think that wouldn't be the first thing I would do. And I also think that, now is a particularly difficult time to do that when we haven't owned up to our own mistakes. We haven't fixed so much of what we need to fix. I think if what this group is here this week to do is precisely not to stand behind the president, but to push him and offer him, support for what he says he wants to do. Let's get it done. Let's get some momentum going. Not to just say, go team, but to say, give us something concrete besides a speech that we can say, develop support for. And that's what we're about.
Part of the reason why I find this gentleman's question important, although I take your point, Elisa, that if you take up arms against your country, you put yourself in the line of fire. The reason I find it important is years before this became the topic du jour, David Petraeus, then CENTCOM commander, had a conversation with Dianne Feinstein where he posed the question of shouldn't we strip the rights of Americans if they take that, because it was raising this question that was in the command staff general's thinking about differentiation, that maybe we needed to do this. And he didn't mention Alaki, but I know that he was talking about Alaki and potentially some others. And Dianne Feinstein at that time said that is a slippery slope that we can't afford to go down. And so even though I take your point that right, you did have people very senior in the Pentagon raising this question about differentiation. So I would like to ask our general and our admiral about how deep that question is among command staff. Was there a move, a serious move beyond Petraeus to begin thinking about how you would differentiate between American and non-American enemies of the state, if you will?
I don't know.
I am unaware that of that discussion, but I go back to what was said earlier, that if a U.S. citizen takes up arms against the United States, he is a problem to be dealt with, and either captured, tried under Article 3 federal court, or the wanted dead or alive.
Right here. And we'll come to you.
I have a question regarding the drone strike conversation we had a little bit earlier on whether or not the CIA targeted killing and select killings were somehow supposed to be incorporated in the discussion, and if so, whether or not they should always be outlawed, should they be limited, or should that power be expressly stripped from the CIA and other intelligence communities?
Well, comments on, I mean, in the president's speech, he makes it clear that that targeted killing program and the use of drones and whatnot will shift from the CIA to within the Pentagon. Maybe we can discuss that aspect of that if that helps move into your arena. We have an online question. I didn't know we. Well, we'll answer this gentleman's question and then go to the online question, which I didn't know we had. That's very cool. Yeah. Thoughts on the question of the targeted killing program, Elisa?
And this is about the moving it out of the CIA and
Right.
into the
DoD.
Yeah, I think part of that is an attempt to be able to be more transparent. And I guess in general, I think, if you're going to be going around the world killing people, you ought to be able to acknowledge that publicly. I mean, we have to be able to stand behind that as a country, and prove that it's lawful. And I gather that the sense is that we can do a better job of that if it is under the auspices of DoD, and also that our warfighters are much more steeped in the laws of war that govern the abilities, the scope, the authorization to use lethal force in combat. That's not the CIA's job. That's not a civilian job. And so I would tend to have more confidence that they would be exercising that authority in that way. But I think there are a lot of questions to be answered still about that. I think we should not rest easy that, if it's all moved into DoD, that those problems are going to be solved. But I think that seems to be part of the rationale for doing it. And John Brennan, who's now CIA director, who was really the architect of this program in the White House, seems to be keen to move it out of the CIA as well. So I think that's a positive step, but we have to wait and see how it really shakes out in practice.
Let's take our online question.
This is from Twitter, from Corey Creeder. Why aren't we seeing NDAA national security waivers for cleared Gitmo prisoners, as per Levin's argument that Obama has the power to transfer them already?
Responses, thoughts? You had a meeting with them yesterday about this.
We had a meeting yesterday with some senior national security officials at the White House, and they recognize that there is that possibility, but it's not easy. There seems to be a disagreement between the White House and Congress about the ease at which these waivers can be accomplished and what is required to go into them. We urged both the White House and members of Congress and the Senate that we met with to work together and they all acknowledge that they want to be able to do that, to work out these disagreements. You know, one group is saying it's easy, go do it. The other group is saying, ooh, it's hard. And so we don't know exactly where the reality is. But they need, you know, if everybody's saying that we want to get this done, they need to work together to make it easier. And right now, that's not happening.
You know, this may be a silly question, but because you can read too much into personalities, but this morning Susan Rice was named as the President's new National Security Advisor. Tom Donilon has stepped down. Tom essentially ran the operation in which so much of this expansion of executive authority and targeted killings expanded. Do you think that change in personnel at the top NSC job matters?
Well, I think that job always matters.
Yeah.
And I think now is it's an interesting time to bring in fresh energy, a new approach. Susan Rice is no shrinking violet, and she's very close personally to the president. They've worked together a long time. I think that's also an advantage. I'm hopeful that will help. You know, he's just laid out a pivot kind of speech. We've got an agenda. He's given his orders. He's got a fresh team, or he will hopefully have the team he wants to be able to move that forward. I'm hopeful that that'll make a difference.
I'm going to go to this. Ray, I've got to take other people, but I'm going to go to this young. Okay. This person in the very back.
I guess my question is related to.
You need to do in the microphone because you've got people watching you. Yeah, please identify.
Hi, my name is Brandon. I'm an intern with the ABA's Human Rights Center. My question is related to this idea of the war winding down. And I'm curious, how do we define that, and to what extent is, when it's winding down, our humanitarian and our international human rights obligations then triggered? And is it that we get to define that, or is it that the groups we're at war with get to define that? And to what extent do we need to put diplomacy in play, negotiate with these groups, or is it always that we just assume that terrorism is bad and when it's triggered we're then in conflict? So I'm curious if we have a framework for when our human rights obligations get triggered in the war on terror.
Thank you. Admiral?
I'll take a whack at it. I'm not entirely sure that I entirely understand. I think you've got two definitional problems. One is winding down and the other is war. The war winding down, that ends up, I think, being an event, an ongoing kind of event, and we all kind of have this sense that we ought to be signing a surrender, or having the enemy sign a surrender on the teak decks of the USS Missouri. That ain't going to happen. So that the quandary is, how do you identify when you've reached the end, when the mission really is accomplished? But during the course of that, wherever we are, whether we're on 9/12 of 2001 or now or years from now, the human rights responsibilities don't change. Whether or not we're at war, the United States still needs to comply with the rule of law and our human rights obligations. It's as I'm fond of saying, it's not a human right unless it applies to all humans, and it's not a rule of law unless it applies all the time. You don't just sort of throw those things over the side because you're at war or in a struggle or in a conflict or whatever it is that that we are in now. So that I don't see the end, whenever or whatever that is, as changing that dynamic.
Generally,
what America should want is a reversal of this militarization of our foreign policy. We have an abundance of talent outside of the military. We have a beautiful military machine, best in the world. There are a lot of problems out there that can be addressed with a lot of other talented people, a lot of other skill sets that we have. Our judicial system is the bright and shining star of the United States. I traveled back a few years ago with a guy who had just built a chicken farm in Zimbabwe. This guy, that was the face of America in that little town, was to develop. He was a chicken farm expert. That's what he did. He established a source of protein in this area in Zimbabwe. That's the face of America that we would like to proliferate, and not so much young men and women with rifles.
Elisa, thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think that's the important question, really, and it's the one that I think prompted the president's speech. And as Admiral Hutson said, and the president acknowledged, we've always said this is a different kind of war. It's going to have a different kind of end, and it's not going to end with a peace treaty or a surrender. We have to decide when we think the threat has been contained. As he said, we're never going to eliminate terrorism, but that the threat is contained sufficiently that we no longer have to be on a war footing to address it. That doesn't mean it goes away or that we can never use military force when necessary to address a threat that arises. But for our democracy, war should be an extraordinary state of affairs, precisely because you're allowed to do things in wartime, perfectly legal in wartime, that you would never want to be the state of affairs for this country or the rest of the world. And so we do need to be the ones that decide that. Al-Qaeda declared war against the United States 5 times before we said yes. We need to be in control of our destiny. As the president said, if we don't define it, it's going to define us. And that's a big problem. So I think he's set out this vision in a way that we now have to have a sense of urgency to deliver on. And I think we heard some of that from these gentlemen this morning.
You might not get the signing on the ship deck, but allowing that authorization of use of military force to expire is going to be extraordinary, because the authorization that it provided was so comprehensive, so global, and allowed the United States to essentially throw in one bucket a lot of dissimilar security challenges in the world and use that authorization under the war against al-Qaeda brand, if you will. And so I do think that's there, and I think that while you may not be allowing the enemies to define the end of that, you are beginning to say that either new authorizations or existing legal standards, criminality, and criminal codes will essentially help govern a lot of that. Ray has a clarification, but I need to, because we're in a short time. I'm going to bring Bill Goodfellow in. I've got too many people, and we'll right at the end allow you the clarification. But yes, Bill Goodfellow.
I had to show up, Steve. I hear in this town, if you don't have at least one heckler in the audience, you're nobody, so I had to show up. Exactly. Here's my question. Is the technology driving the policy? After Iraq, after Afghanistan, there's very little enthusiasm for large-scale interventions, and the military budget is shrinking ever so slightly, and drones seem to be the cheap way to go. To what extent is the technology, the easy availability of drones, driving the policy?
Interesting. Elisa?
Yeah, I have heard that very concern expressed by military commanders, serving military commanders, that, drones are a tactic, not a strategy, but they've become, in some ways, our strategy. And, even if you listen to some of what the president said, not in this speech, but before, if we have a problem, we no longer have to send in 60,000 troops. We can just send an unmanned drone over. And I do think, aside from the legal concerns, that we haven't done a very good job in this country thinking about the impact that the ease of that technology has on decisions about when to go to war and when to stop. It is getting too easy, and it really does have an impact on our thinking that I don't think we have grappled with as a country, and I don't think our military commanders have grappled with yet. And I think it's a very, very important question. John, did you want to add something to that?
No, I just sort of whispered to Elisa, the war we run the risk of war getting too easy. You know, there's not a draft. There are very few Americans who actually are boots on the ground, and then we start doing things even more from a distance. We've got to be careful about that, and you know, it's hard to turn down a new weapon system. You know, it's pretty attractive to have, but we've got to be careful about how we use it, and that's the struggle we're in right now.
Well, engineers do get out in front of the law from time to time. Gas during World War I looked like a great way to conduct warfare. Not so good now. I think that drones give drones plus internet proliferation of information, which makes the whole terrorism issue that much easier to execute their operations. All of this is a mash right now that our legal system is sorting out.
Cyber war, you know, the next new frontier.
Right. We do need to bring this to a close, but I want to give Ray, apologize for the other questions, give Ray McGovern a very quick chance for clarification, since we want to be fair-minded.
Yes, I just want to ask you, John, at the White House okay, yeah. Ray McGovern, veteran.
I thought, so you only have a moment, so
yeah,
you're
sure.
asking another question.
No, it's not a question.
Yeah.
It's a clarification. Did they not tell you at the White House yesterday that Carl Levin sent a memo to the president on the 6th of May saying, look, I fought really hard for a waiver. You can release those 68 people now. Why do you believe the White House when the White House says it's so difficult? It's easy as pie, and Carl Levin says so.
Great, thank you. Okay. Great question. Any final thoughts?
I can just say about that. Of course, we know about the letter. We've been working closely with Senator Levin's office. We all knew about the letter going in, and as I heard Admiral Hutson, he said that, you know, there's a disagreement here between the Hill and the White House, and what this group is urging is that, you know, we're trying to be pragmatic about how you move forward. They need to get together. If the White House needs a different kind of waiver authority to move forward, we encourage them, draft up some and go to Congress. We talked to Senator Levin's office, and they said we'd be happy to work with them on that. So, you know, we need to get some, you know, sense of urgency on both sides about how to deal with it.
I would just say, just in closing, you know, the questions that have come and been raised are really vital for the country. We haven't discussed many other subjects slightly out of it, but I have to tell you, as a journalist looking at the subpoenas and the authorizations given to essentially spy on reporters and to criminalize reporting in the national security area, whether it was Fox News or not, it's a remarkable time. You just almost can't believe what you're reading and seeing. And I remember a political science professor of mine saying you never really know the norms of a society unless you see that and watch that society under stress. And that is a fundamental. We're not making laws for times when the sun is shining. You're basically making laws and rules and norms when things are rough. And I think that that's what we're trying to struggle with today. I want to thank General Paul Eaton, Elisa Massimino, and Rear Admiral John Hutson for a wonderful discussion, and thank all of you for joining us today. Thanks to Human Rights.
Thank you, Steve.